Now, we're likely 100 or so lessons into this course by now, but I have to say this is probably going to be one of my favorite ones, just because I love this framework so much, and it really drives home the concept of what indicators of compromise, or IOCs, really are. And as we've sort of been working our way down from more conceptual frameworks to map out threat actors or their motivations, and ultimately the chain of their attacks, well, the pyramid of pain allows us to look into the actual internals of some of those middle stages in the kill chain, the actual malware, the exploits, the payloads, and the different methods of how they can be detected. And the pyramid of pain is a conceptual model that illustrates the various impact of several of these indicators of compromise, and it measures this impact on adversaries when they're used for detection and response. And it emphasizes the idea that not all of these indicators, or IOCs, are equal in their ability to disrupt an adversary's operation, and as the name suggests, cause them pain. And so it's a fairly simple concept to grasp, and the best part is it's not just an entire conceptual framework, right? We can actively apply the concepts of the pyramid of pain in a more tangible way within our SOC. For example, when we're writing out incident detection rules. And credit where credit is due here, of course, the pyramid of pain was developed by David Bianco as part of a discussion around detection strategies in his organization, and the problem he had around trying to convey and describe and get across the idea of why simply ingesting more and more threat intelligence is not the silver bullet or the magical answer. And so in an effort to argue how to best prioritize cyber threat intelligence data and get more value out of it, well, he developed this model to show how not all IOCs, or indicators of compromise, are created equal. And so the pyramid consists of 6 different levels, each representing a different type of indicator, or IOC, with the difficulty of the adversary changing their tactics increasing as we move up the pyramid. And this will start to make more sense as we get into the individual layers. But we can also think of the Locard's exchange principle, which states that any contact leaves behind a trace, meaning that when 2 objects come into contact with one another, there's always an exchange of materials between them. And within forensic science, it's this idea of that the perpetrator of a crime will always bring something to the crime scene, and leave taking something from it. And so both can be used for forensic evidence. And this applies to computer crime or computer forensics as well. And so what this means is that if a threat actor is doing something on our network, then they're leaving behind some kind of trace, and they can't avoid that. And so our job is to find these traces and notice when those traces are being left within our network and respond accordingly, or do something with them and disrupt whatever the attacker is doing in their kill chain. And if we can find that indicator, then the attacker loses that method, or that tool, or that tactic, or technique, and they then have to replace it. And the difficulty of replacing that indicator, or whatever created the indicator, and the general pain it would cause the attacker to have to go through to replace that, is the entire crux of what the pyramid of pain maps out. And so without further ado, let's start breaking down the different levels of the pyramid of pain. And so first we have an indicator that we're pretty likely familiar with from our different investigations in the course. And that's of course hash values. And what we're really referring to here are the static hash values, so things like SHA-1, or MD5, or SHA-256, rather than any fuzzy hashes like SSDeep or other context-triggered hashes. Because unlike traditional hash functions like MD5 or SHA-1, which generate a fixed size hash value regardless of the input size, we also have hashing algorithms and utilities like SSDeep that can produce a hash that's designed to be similar when the inputs are similar, even if they have small differences between the 2 files. But anyways, all of that is to say is we're focusing on the traditional cryptographic hashes, like again, MD5 or SHA-1 or SHA-256. And so when we collect a piece of malware, say from a phishing email, or extracted from a packet capture or an endpoint, we often have these means to obtain a file's hash, either manually or automatically. And we can then go about creating detection rules to block that piece of malware if we were to come across it later on in the field. However, the reason why hashes are at the bottom here of the pyramid, or classified as trivial, is due to the very nature of how these hashes are built. Right? And so we can have 2 identical files, and of course they're going to have the same file hash. That's just how hashing works and why it's important. But if we were to change just a single bit of one file, then the 2 files would have wildly different hash values. And let's demonstrate this. And so on my Ubuntu machine here, I'm just going to nano a new file called malware1.exe. And it's not actually going to be an executable, but just for this example. And within this file, I'm just going to type the phrase hello world. All right, and so I'm just going to save this. And so we have one file here. And now what I'll do is just copy this file, and I'm just going to call it malware2.exe. And so, do you think these files have the same hashes? Well, of course they do, as you can see here. However, all I need to do now is just change one actual single bit of one of these files, and I can do that using the hex edit tool. And if you don't have this installed, we can just run sudo apt install hexedit. You don't even have to follow along, it's not that important. I just want to demonstrate the process of changing one of these bits. And now if I run hexedit against one of my malware files, well, we're now looking at the actual hex makeup of this file. And so we can see 48 here refers to the H. The 65 here is the E, right? So you can sort of see how it's being translated over to here. And so all I need to do is just, again, change one bit of the file. And so this 8 here, I'm going to change it to a 7. And now instead of hello world, we have Jello world, which is a world I want to live in. And so I'm just going to save this by pressing Ctrl X and then Y. And now we still have our two files here, right? But this time, if I go back up in my history here, back to our SHA-256 command, well, I'm going to run it again. And this time, we have completely different hash values, right? So this was the original hash, but malware2 here now has a completely different hash value. None of these line up, right? None of these characters line up. Well, maybe one or two of them do, but that's not the point. This is a completely different value, right? And so if we created a detection rule on OBA90 blah, 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 well, all the attacker needed to do was just change that one bit, and we would no longer detect it. And so you can see that because of this, it's so trivial for an attacker to change the hash indicators that they're leaving behind on the victim, because they can so easily and so quickly change the malware's hash value. And sometimes these hashes are so easily and susceptible to change that they can even end up changing on their own, like by accident. Say for some sort of transmission error that changed one of the bits, or some metadata was appended to the file, or simply just recompiling the same malware at a later date. That could also change the hash as well. And so again, any detection rules around file hashes, we're not really causing that much pain to our adversaries. Attackers have advanced far past the static hash signature detections, and so it's not a really high value indicator for us. And so this brings us to IP addresses, or the Internet Protocol addresses, which is next and slightly more painful of an indicator that we can inflict on our adversaries, but again, we're still talking about a relatively easy indicator here, right? And we talked earlier about why IP addresses are such fundamental indicators for malware, and are often somewhere we want to still start when investigating endpoints. And that's because you pretty much have to have some sort of network connection in order to carry out an attack, or control an endpoint, or exfiltrate data. And with connections, well, we are talking about the network here, and so that's always going to be an IP address of some sort. And so IP address indicators are just the address of the devices connected to the network that carry out the attack. And so it could be the attacker's infrastructure, or a server that they're using to stage the attack, like their command and control server, or the IPs of other infected endpoints as part of a larger botnet. And as analysts or responders, well, we might find IP addresses as indicators of compromise within, obviously, packet captures, or through any of our network protocol alerts, or even hard-coded within malware itself. Remember, when we created our Meterpreter payloads earlier, we had to specify our simulated attacker's IP address. And so there are a lot of different ways that we can extract IPs, but we have to remember that the reason why IP addresses are so low on the bottom of the pyramid here is because, again, they're pretty easy for an attacker to change. If you block an attacker's IP address from sending out email, well, they can just move their email server over to a different IP address, or use a different email provider. And especially with the abundance of cloud infrastructure these days, well, you can get a new IP address assigned to you pretty quickly and pretty easily. And it's not something that an attacker is really tied to these days. Especially if they're using an anonymous browsing service, or something like Tor or an anonymous proxy. An attacker's IP address might change around all the time, and so it's not really an effective indicator for us. And another reason why IP indicators aren't as high value, at least not anymore, is due to things like content delivery networks, where we have legitimate services like Akamai that distribute infrastructure across a large network of servers across the world. And so if an attacker is doing something like this, or rather abusing it, to mask their true origin of traffic, well, again, this makes it so hard for us to track and block. And there are also things like fast flux as well. And fast flux is a technique used by attackers to hide phishing and malware delivery sites behind an ever-changing network of compromised hosts that are acting as proxies. And so the basic idea is to rapidly change the IP address associated with a domain name. And obviously that makes it much more challenging for us as defenders to block malicious activities based on IP addresses alone, since they're always switching around and sort of hiding behind a domain name. Which of course brings us to domain names, which is still green on the pyramid here, but as you can see, a slightly lighter green. I mean, it's a bit more trouble to go about registering a new domain name and dealing with registrars and paying for the domain, but it's really not much of a concern for a determined threat actor. And with that being said, there are a large number of DNS providers out there with very lax registration standards, and some of which are even free. And so again, in practice, it's not too hard to change domain names. However, as we discussed during the phishing section, we do have techniques in our back pocket to help with domain abuse, like blocking any new domains created in the past 30 days. And so if an attacker had to run out and register a brand new domain, well, we'd proactively be blocking them once again. However, to turn things back around on us, a determined attacker will likely have multiple domain names already staged, with the adequate domain ages and ready to go for an attack. And again, we can typically find domain-related IOCs when we're looking at packet captures, so looking at any DNS requests, or at the live endpoint level, or through dynamic sandboxing. Again, looking at what DNS queries were made and what domains were contacted. Or sometimes we can find this within the malware itself. If an attacker is using something like FastFlux or dynamic DNS, well, the domain name has to be specified somewhere, right? And again, using Lockhart's exchange principle, if it's there, then we can find it. And so, speaking of the exchange principle, this brings us to different indications on what host or network level artifacts are left behind from the attacker. Because again, as the attacker is doing things like exploiting their malware or dropping files on disk, or in the installation phase, carving out and installing persistence mechanisms and backdoors, well, there will inevitably be indicators in the form of artifacts or evidence on the host, like in the logs or the auto-run locations or installed services or tasks, and also on the network level as well. Is there a registry key? We can think about the auto-start locations that we talked about, or the registry keys that get added when a service is installed. Is there a specific file that was dropped on disk, under a certain directory? Is there a certain way in which the command and control channel is constructed? Or is there a specific specified user agent? Remember, we looked at user agents in the wild like Southside, or even user agents that contain slight misspellings. Or maybe, since we can't just rely on domains for detections, maybe an attacker is constantly changing their domain names, but the URL pattern that they use to receive C2 traffic has a specific pattern that we can recognize or write some regular expressions around to detect. And so we can do a lot of the detections at this level using things like Yara and Sigma rules, and we'll be getting into some of that shortly. And so these artifacts can hold a bit more value and occupy a higher position on the pyramid because they're more complex and difficult or annoying for adversaries to change compared to the more lower level indicators like IP addresses or domain names. Right? And so to get around these artifact level detections, an attacker is going to have to modify their tools, right? Modify their code. And this could be really small changes, but the pain here is that the attacker doesn't know what exactly is being detected. And so they'll have to do a bunch of testing and recompiling. And it's just as the name suggests here, it's a pain. And expanding on the host and network related indicators, well, we have tools. And these are just the software or utilities that the attackers use to execute their attacks, right? Like their exploits, their payloads. And like we talked about, these tools can range from custom-built malware to just pre-written exploits found online. But either way, if we can start detecting entire tools and the way that these tools work, it becomes genuinely challenging for adversaries to change or get around detections. Because again, like we talked about, it could be a significant upfront cost to research or develop or purchase these tools. Maybe they're using a specific piece of malware that, while they can get around some of the lower level indicators, the actual payloads and the way in which the malware operates has become burned or detected. And so the attacker really has no other option but to switch tooling. Or it could be exploitation frameworks like Metasploit or Cobalt Strike. And if we can detect these, then the attacker's going to have to switch. And we usually get to this stage on the pyramid when all of our previous detection mechanisms have become so effective at identifying the artifacts of the tool itself in various ways. And because of this, well, our adversary is forced to abandon the tool and either find or develop a new tool to achieve the same purpose. And so again, we can look to Yara or Sigma rules to develop these specific tool indicators, or even things like fuzzy hashes, where we can perform more similarity analysis even if two binaries or files have minor differences. And once we're detecting tools, well, we're making it pretty dang challenging for the attacker to get around. But if they're really determined and highly sophisticated, and of course financially backed, well, we might have to summit the pyramid, and look at the TTPs, or the tactics, techniques, and procedures used by the attacker. And really, this is just behavior, right? It's the way in which the adversary is trained. It's their preferences, and the way that those all come together in the form of activities on the network and systems. And so, no matter what tools they use or artifacts or what IOCs like the domain names or IP addresses they use, it doesn't matter, right? Because now we're looking at the attacker through the lens of a very high level. And so, on the tactics side, these are the high-level objectives or goals that the adversaries aim to achieve. So we can also think about actions on objectives as well here. For example, an adversary's tactic might be to establish persistent access to a compromised system, or to exfiltrate sensitive data. Again, what are those actions on objectives? And the ways in which they go about exfiltrating data might be unique to their behavior, which brings us to techniques. And techniques are more detailed than tactics, and they describe how adversaries carry out their actual activities. For instance, a technique for persistence might involve creating a new user account, or installing a service. Or for exfiltration purposes, we could be looking at the actual directories or file names that the adversary uses. For example, maybe they call their file foobar.zip, and then they map a network share with a specific name, or they use a specific drive. It's all these small things that add up to paint a picture of who this threat actor is. We're essentially profiling them. And the gold standard when it comes to looking at TTPs is the MITRE ATT&CK framework, specifically the Enterprise Matrix. And we're going to touch on this in more detail very shortly, but you can see how it maps out all sorts of techniques and tactics and procedures that real threat actors in the real world love to use. So things like reconnaissance, or initial access, or execution, or even persistence techniques. The ways in which an attacker escalates privileges, or evades detection, or moves laterally, or sets up command and control. And if we start detecting and attacking back against an adversary's training, or the general behavior of what actions they like to perform when they get initial access, or the ways in which they go about reconnaissance or delivery, well, that's really, really tough for an attacker to get around. Because again, it's behavior-based. It's the things that they do without even realizing it. And like a habit, it's hard to change. And at this point, they basically have two options. They can either painstakingly figure out what behavioral indicators we're detecting, and then try to consciously change their behavior and training or procedures, and of course, while they're doing all that, reinvest in tooling and training and everything else. Or they can find another target. And that's the point of the Pyramid of Pain, to chase them up the ladder or the pyramid until it becomes too uncomfortable or too much of a pain. And then they give up. They leave. They turn around and never come back. And the extent that you have to go to chase an adversary up this pyramid entirely depends, again, on things like their motivation, their resources, their financial backing or sophistication. And so when we're talking about TTPs, we're thinking about advanced persistent threats a lot of the time and the data that we have on their behavior. And so that was it. That is the Pyramid of Pain. And it's a fantastic way to understand indicators of compromise and what types of indicators are out there, and the value or usefulness of these indicators as they relate to stopping an adversary long term.